some of the kids.
By the way, they took me out for a call while you were gone, and I signed you up for overseas work.
Really?
All right,
Okay.
I'll go ahead and get us started. We are on Psalm 97.
7. I couldn't remember what it was.
97. So per usual, we are going to start off praying through Psalm 97. After we get through Psalm 97, we continue in prayer. I do want to pray for and like to encourage y'all to pray for the youth minister at Canadian. His name's Barry Hobson. He fell 25 feet out of a tree over the weekend.
Wow.
And he is they had to airlift him to Amarillo. And he is going into surgery as we speak for one of probably 2 surgeries. They expect to have another one later this week.
What's his name?
Barry Hobson.
Oh.
Hob.
B.
H-O-B-S-O.
Okay.
Hobson.
He failed, did you say?
Mm-hmm.
25.
Yeah, he was clearing some limbs around a deer stand, and his strap broke, and
Deer will get him every time.
and he fell. He fell and somehow was able to get up and drive himself home and call for help before.
Is he married? Does he have
Yes,
children?
he's married. He has 1 son.
Probably internally.
So he has a couple. I think he has 2 cracked vertebrae in his back that will heal on their own. They're actually not too concerned about that, which kind of became
How
lucky.
old is
He is. I don't know his exact age. He is around 40. He's older for a
For you.
for a youth minister.
Missed the song?
But
He had a chainsaw?
yeah, he fell on the exact place where you would want to fall, and like I said, fell where there was not major damage to his spine. Most of the damage was to his ribs, so that's what they're going into. And the damage to the ribs caused collapsed lung and some stuff
What
like
did
that.
you say broke and he would?
His strap, it was
Yeah,
around his
okay,
strap.
Mhm.
okay, but what were you saying that would heal on its own?
His back. His
Strap.
There
Yeah.
were some cracks.
His back will heal on its own. They're going in today and later this week to stabilize his fractured ribs, and
That's not
so as of now, my understanding is in terms of him recovering, they're not concerned about. They don't know what that recovery will look like. You know, they've got to get everything put back in place and healed and get him started in physical therapy to know what that's gonna,
And then when he gets my age, he'll show up.
what that will look like. Yeah. So, but you know, at first the fear was whether or not he would recover, and luckily it was a lot of damage, but the least amount of damage that you could have falling 25 feet out of
Yeah.
a tree. But like I said, at 9:30 was when he was, this morning was when he was supposed to have his first surgery, and I don't have an update yet, so I'm assuming that he was taken into surgery. All right, we'll start with Psalm 97. The Lord is king, let the earth rejoice, let the many coastlands be glad. Clouds and thick darkness are all around him. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne. Fire goes before him and consumes his adversary on every side. His lightnings light up the world. The earth sees and trembles. The mountains melt like wax before the Lord of all the earth. The heavens proclaim his righteousness, and all the peoples behold his glory. All worshippers of images are put to shame, those who make their boast in worthless idols. All gods bow down before him. Zion hears and is glad, and the towns of Judah rejoice because of your judgments, O God. For you, O Lord, are most high over all the earth. You are exalted far above all gods. The Lord loves those who hate evil. He guards the lives of his faithful. He rescues them from the hand of the wicked. Light dawns for the righteous, and joy for the upright in heart. Rejoice in the Lord, O you righteous, and give thanks to his holy name. And Lord, we also want to pray this morning that your Spirit will be present with us as we study together. And we want to lay before you Barry at this time as he gets ready or already has entered into surgery, that you will be with him and strengthen him, that you will guide the doctors who are overseeing the surgery and his recovery, that you will be with his family and all those who are surrounding him with love and support at this time, that they may feel your presence and your peace. We are confident in your presence there and here with us as well. And it is in your Son's name that we pray. Amen. All right, back to the Gospel of Mark. I think that this is the last time we'll be in Mark, I think. So I'm gone the next 2 weeks, wedding, honeymoon, that kind of a thing. And then I will be back one more Sunday before the move. And I think next Sunday we're going to do something a little bit different. In class, there's kind of there's a discussion that I would like to have for partially selfish reasons. But it kind of like when we had the discussion over the meaning of the church and the kingdom, there's been some stuff that I've been working on and writing about recently that I would like to have a little bit of a conversation, kind of help me think through some things. So that may be, I don't know, we'll kind of see what that ends up looking like. But with that being said, we are in this section of Mark where Jesus is teaching and doing things around the Sea of Galilee still. In chapter 6, verses 30 through 44 is the story we looked at last week of Jesus feeding the 5,000, and we talked about how significant that was for the early church. Now we're moving into verse 45 of chapter 6. After Jesus feeds the 5,000, it says that immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. So you'll notice again we've had Jesus kind of going back and forth across the Sea of Galilee. He just has fed the 5,000. He puts the disciples in a boat and he says, y'all go ahead onto the other side and I'll meet you over there. After saying farewell to them, he went up to the mountain to pray. Verse 47, when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land, he being Jesus. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came towards them early in the morning, walking on the sea. He intended to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. This story of Jesus walking on the water is, I think, a neat one that most people have heard before. It's just kind of a unique thing of Jesus walking on the water. A lot of the times our mind goes to the version, Peter gets out of the boat and tries to walk towards Jesus and ends up sinking, but we don't get that here in this story. But we still, I don't know, I think there's something cool to us about just this idea of walking on the water. But if you get into the details, which I want to do here for just a couple of minutes, this is a strange story for a couple of reasons. There's some aspects to this story that does not make a whole lot of sense. One of them is Jesus sending of the disciples. So he tells them, y'all get into the boat and go across. I'm not coming with you. Which is an odd thing for Jesus to do, because he doesn't do that in any other place in the gospel. When he goes, we've seen Jesus go to abandoned places to spend some time alone, and normally the disciples are with him, but this is a different case. So Jesus has just been with 5,000 men, plus women and children. So we talked about, probably at least 15,000 people. Jesus has been around and feeding them and all of this. And so it makes sense that Jesus wants a little bit of time to rest and recover. Because if you remember, leading into that story, the disciples and Jesus tried to find an abandoned place to rest and to eat, because they hadn't. And these crowds come and find them, and this leads to the feeding of the 5,000. That's why they're in an abandoned place with no food, because he and his disciples are trying to get away. And so it makes sense now that Jesus is trying to take this time to get away a little bit and to rest, to recover, but he doesn't do so with the disciples, which, I don't know about you, it makes me wonder if this whole walking on the water thing was somehow planned, that he sent the disciples on the boat by themselves, knowing that they would get stuck in the middle of the sea overnight with this big storm, and that he was going to come walking by them, maybe. Maybe it wasn't something that Jesus had planned, but it is kind of an odd thing that he sends them on their own to cross over the sea. When they're on their way, though, as I said, it's in the middle of the night. There's this storm. It doesn't seem to be a storm to the same degree as the previous storm. So we've already had a story where Jesus and the disciples are on the water. Jesus is asleep. This storm comes. The disciples come to Jesus and say, don't you care that we're about to be destroyed? And Jesus kind of rebukes the disciples a little bit for their lack of faith and then calms the storm. And I mentioned in that story that for the disciples to be so afraid, it had to be a very bad storm, because we know we had, as a part of the disciples, some we had among the disciples some very experienced fishermen. And for experienced fishermen who spend their lives out on this sea to be that afraid of a storm, it had to be a fairly bad storm. In this story of Jesus walking on the water, it doesn't seem the storm is that bad. It doesn't seem that they're afraid of being destroyed or dying quite like they were before. We're just told that Jesus looks out and he sees them struggling against these heavy winds that are coming across the sea, which is also an interesting thing, because if it is a storm, it's interesting how Jesus was able to see them out in the middle of the, but he does. They're out in the middle. They're struggling against the wind. And so Jesus goes out to them walking on the water. And another weird aspect of the story is that we're told Jesus didn't intend to stop and talk to them or get into the boat. Mark says he intended just to pass by them, which is an odd thing, because if you think about it for a minute, why was that Jesus' intention? That's not what happened, right? But his intention was just to walk past them, and he stops because of how terrified the disciples are, rightly so. Sometimes we can be a little judgmental about the disciples' lack of faith or fear, and we've talked about in Mark, there's this comparison between faith versus fear, and how are we going to respond to Jesus. And the disciples have some moments where they respond in faith, like when they leave everything to follow Jesus, but most of the time they respond in fear. They responded in fear in the last storm on the sea, and when they see Jesus passing by, they're terrified. So they respond in fear as well. But like I said, sometimes we can be a little bit judgmental, and I kind of want to push back against that, because I don't know about you, but if I'm out on the middle of a lake and there's a storm and some dude Jesus starts walking past me on the water, I'm going to be quite terrified as well. And they assumed that it was a ghost, which is probably what we would all assume as well. There's something weird and supernatural that is going on here. So they become terrified, and so Jesus stops to calm them down. That's why he stops and doesn't pass by. He stops in order to calm the disciples' fear and let them know it is it's me, it's Jesus who's walking beside you. There's nothing walking on the water, there's nothing to fear. And then Jesus gets into the boat, and immediately as he gets into the boat, the storm completely stops. Now, as for Jesus walking by or passing by the boat, what I think is going on here is I think that we get some echoes of the story with Moses. So if you remember, Moses asks to see God, and God says, well, you can't see me in all of my glory, otherwise you will die. And so what does God do? God passes by Moses. And so this language of passing by may be for Mark, that may be what may be going on is a reference back to Moses, and saying that in the way that God passed by Moses so that Moses could see at least part of God and know God's power and presence with them. Perhaps that's Jesus' intention here, is as the disciples are in the midst of the storm, Jesus is going to pass by as God incarnate in the same way that God did with Moses, to illustrate the same kind of thing to the disciples, that in the midst of this storm, that they could see not only Jesus' power, but Jesus' presence with them as well. That could also be the meaning of when the disciples become fearful, Jesus responds by saying, "It is I." That could be a reference back to the divine name. If you remember, again with Moses is at the burning bush, and God gives Moses his name as Yahweh, which means something to the effect of, I am that I am, or I will be that I will be, something along those lines. And so Jesus saying, "It is I," or "I am," is the one who's passing by, could also be a reference back to this Moses story. And maybe there's even something here that has to do with like the Red Sea crossing or something like that. Maybe Mark has some of that imagery in mind. But what makes the most sense of some of those weird parts of the story is that Mark is writing it in a way that brings us back to the story of Moses.
It's the same time that Peter walks out to Jesus walking on the water.
Maybe. So we get some, you know, in the different Gospels, we get different versions of the same story. And so there's debate among, you know, I'll mention scholars. There's debate on how we read some of these stories. Does it happen once? Does it happen twice? And because you get the same thing with, like, you have stories of Jesus feeding 5,000 and Jesus feeding 4,000, and there's questions on, well, is this the same story? And sometime, you know, because all of this began in oral tradition, and sometime in the telling of the stories, it kind of split into two different versions of the exact same event that's happened. I tend to be on the side of these all being the same story and told in different ways by different people for different purposes, right? So you could have one author that wants to emphasize the Peter portion of it, and you might have another author who doesn't really care about that portion, wants to emphasize the Jesus portion of the story. So to answer your question, my opinion is yes, I think we're talking about the same kind of event, but there's two different ways to tell it. And I think Mark here is wanting to focus on Jesus' presence with the disciples, less so than Peter's response to Jesus walking on the water.
Talking about being judgmental about the disciples all the time. Just try to put yourself in their shoes.
Yeah. Yeah, I was, yesterday, Antasia and I were actually talking about this. So she started classes at ACU. One of the classes she's in right now is an introduction to the New Testament type class, and they're starting with the Gospel of Mark, which I think is the correct starting point. Not that anybody cares, but if I was teaching a class, I would start with the Gospel of Mark as well, the first gospel that we have written, and kind of move on from there. So I think that's a good starting point. And their assignment or discussion question about Mark had to do with discipleship, because we've talked a lot about Mark's trying to answer two questions that are related. Who is Jesus? And based on that answer, what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus? And so we were talking about Mark has the most negative portrayal of the disciples. They very rarely get things right. They normally, like I said, respond in fear rather than faith. And that's kind of the dichotomy that Mark sets up in most of the stories. Are the disciples going to respond faithfully or fearfully? And they normally respond in fear, and then Jesus kind of rebukes them by saying they need to be a bit more faithful. But, like you said, put yourself in the disciples' shoes. I'm not convinced any of us would have responded any better than the disciples do. We probably would have responded much worse than the disciples actually do, maybe a lot more fearful. But there comes with this both, I think, some comfort and some challenge. Right? There's some challenge in Mark is challenging us, and Jesus is challenging us and the disciples to respond better than this, to respond consistently in faith rather than in fear, which is not an easy thing to do, even today. Right? It becomes a lot easier to be fearful of things in life, especially fearful of things that are meaningful to us. So, we opened up, I was telling you about Barry's situation, and I can't imagine the fear that his family continues to feel. The closer we are and the more important something is, the easier it is for us to have this response of fear. And so there's a challenge here with the disciples of thinking about fear response versus faith response. But I also think with the disciples, and with most of the characters in Mark's gospel, there's a bit of comfort in that the disciples get it wrong much more than they get it right, and Jesus doesn't kick them out and go find another group of 12 disciples that he thinks are going to be a bit more faithful than this group of 12. Right? Jesus sticks it out with them. When the disciples are fearful in the midst of something like a storm, and I know a lot of the times, and I think rightly so, we want to think about the storms in our own life. When we find ourselves in situations like the disciples, and we're filled with fear, where maybe we should show a little bit more reliance on Jesus, but we're filled with fear, in those moments, Jesus, like he does in this story, still kind of has a way of just walking past us. And when we need him, kind of stopping and turning to us and getting into our boat and kind of helping some of those fears calm down and subside. But sometimes all we need, I think, and I think Mark is trying to say also that all the disciples really needed is just Jesus to pass by. They didn't fully need him to get into the boat, though Jesus did. But it should have been satisfactory, I think is what Mark wants us to imagine, that Jesus just passes by and says, hey, I'm with you. Keep rowing, keep pushing, keep moving forward, and I'm going to walk past, and I'm going to be there with you. And I think that's the way that life tends to go. We talk about Jesus' presence with us during the difficult things that go on in life, and we pray to God, rightly so, for these situations that we're going through. But sometimes I wonder if too often we expect the result of Jesus' presence and the result of our prayers to mean that God's just going to stop everything that's going on. believe that happens. I'm not convinced that that's the normal result, right? And most of us in our own personal lives can testify to the fact that normally the result of that is not immediate, like in this story of it just all stops. Though I have faith that does happen. I think a lot more often what we're called to do is what Mark thinks should have happened in this story. And that is that Jesus passes by. The disciples recognize that Jesus is present and they keep on rowing, knowing that Jesus is there, knowing that the boat's not going to be destroyed, knowing that eventually we're going to make it to the other side. I think that's more the normal that happens during our own storms, is that in those moments there are ways that Jesus passes by and lets us know that he's there with us, that he's there in essence rowing against the wind along with us, and that we're eventually going to get to the other side. We're eventually going to arrive at our destination. I know that for a while on Wednesday nights talking about the book of Job, and I've mentioned that to me that's the message of Job. It's not why suffering happens, because we really don't get an explanation to that in the book. Neither does Job. I think the point of the book and why God kind of gets mad at the end is that the response is not to explain it away, but to kind of dwell in the presence of God. And I think that's what we have going on with this story. And you know, if you want to add into it, and you think of the story when they're out in a storm and Jesus comes to them walking on the water, and Peter gets out to show his faith to make it through that storm, that he ends up becoming so preoccupied with the storm that he begins to sink, right, instead of keeping his eyes on Jesus. But this story, and I kind of want to move on and finish chapter 6 here. This story, Jesus comes to them walking on the water as they're going across to the other side. And so in verse 53, we're told that when they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored the boat. When they got out of the boat, people at once recognized him and rushed about the whole region, began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. Wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak. And all who touched it were healed. There's two interesting things about the way that chapter 6 ends. So Jesus and his disciples, they make it over to the other side. They are in the land of Gentiles. Mark's probably writing to a Gentile audience, emphasizing that Jesus' ministry is not just for the Jews, but for all people. They hear that Jesus is there. And so Mark is showing us how widespread word about what Jesus is doing has spread. It's not just in Capernaum and Nazareth where we've seen Jesus thus far. It's not just in that northern area of Galilee where Jesus' ministry begins, that is Jew dominant. It's spreading throughout the entire region, among not just the Jews, but also among Gentiles. And all of these people, all of the Gentiles are bringing people to Jesus to be healed. But what's interesting, notice how they bring people. We're told they bring people in two ways. One, they bring people on mats to Jesus. We've already heard a story at the beginning of Mark of a man being brought to Jesus on a mat. They couldn't get in because of the crowd. They have to go under the roof and cut this hole and lower Jesus down. And so it seems that people have heard this story about the other man on a mat, and so they too are bringing people to Jesus on a mat. But they're also bringing Jesus into the marketplaces with hopes that they'll just be able to touch the fringe of Jesus' garment. And we just got a story where that happened. The woman with the bleeding problem that goes into the crowd and touches the hem of Jesus' cloak and becomes healed. Again, it seems likely that they've heard that story as well. And so they know, hey, there was this woman that all she had to do was touch the fringes of Jesus' garment and she was healed. So let's go lay our sick where we know that Jesus is going to be walking by, with the hope that even if he doesn't stop, they'll be able to turn and hold on to even just the fringes of Jesus' garment.
One of the things I want to talk about here, Mark chapter 5. We go back to that. That's where he restores a demon-possessed man.
Mhm.
Now, this man had been actually chained at one point into the cemeteries and stuff to keep, people around there were all scared to death of this man. And he was so full of demons, he broke the chains. Now, it says the region of Genesis, which is basically, you go back to chapter 6, Jesus is coming back to, he's coming back to that area, and it says that when he gets there, people ran up and brought their, wasn't that the same people that told him to leave prior, and that was before the demon-possessed man went all around and told everybody what happened. But a lot of those people, they were telling him, get out, leave, and then when he comes back, I don't know what time period it was there, but hearing about Jesus through, I like to think, the same man that everybody hated and didn't want anything to do with, he goes and spreads the word. Jesus so many times uses people that we would not choose, to go and spread his word. And he did that, and when he comes back, it's the same region. I think that the word is 10 cities, and all of that area there. Here these people are running with their sick. They have heard about Jesus. They saw what he did to the demon-possessed man, and they know that he can heal them.
Yeah, because you get there's the geography here is difficult because this place of the Gerasenes, or in the manuscripts there's a couple different ways that it's worded, and the demon-possessed man, we don't actually know where exactly this place was. But we know he's in Gentile territory. We know here, again, he's in Gentile territory. So I think you're right. Mark wants us to connect these stories together because they're two stories where Jesus has crossed over from Jewish territory, where he does 99.9% of his ministry. But we get these few stories every once in a while of Jesus crossing over into Gentile territory. And you have the demon-possessed, and again, I want us to think in terms of discipleship and faith versus fear. So the demon-possessed man responds in faith. He wants to go back with Jesus. So we could think, he wants to be the 13th disciple. And Jesus says, well, you can't come back with me. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But he tells him to stay and to go and tell what's happened, which is different than what Jesus was doing in the Jewish territory, right? He was telling people, don't go tell anybody. But he tells the demon-possessed man to go and tell. And you're right, the crowd responds in fear, which, if you have this guy that even chains couldn't control, and this man shows up and just speaks and gets this man under control, that's kind of a scary thing. But again, it's fear, which is what Mark comes, they respond in fear. And then Jesus, they want him to leave, and so Jesus does, he crosses back over. But eventually he comes back to the Gentile territory, and we get a very different response. We get a response at least of partial faith, because we've kind of talked about that of, you think of these people that come to Jesus to be healed. They don't always display the strongest faith. The woman with the bleeding problem is a prime example. She didn't want to talk to Jesus. She didn't want to interact with him. She responds in fear when Jesus stops. But she had enough faith to take it upon herself to go and touch the hem of Jesus' garment. There's, again, back to, Tay and I were talking about that story last night, and she made an interesting comment of thinking about how much that woman takes it into her own power to find healing. There's something to say, and we don't have time to get into it, but there's something to say about the agency that she takes to go and do that. Kind of along the same lines of the friends that bring the man on the mat. There's some faith in their agency and willingness to, hey, we're going to pick up this guy and walk with him. I don't know, were they next door or were they 4 towns over? I mean, how long were they walking with this man on the mat? But there's some agency there, and we're going to go and seek out Jesus to make ourselves well, to bring us to an area of wholeness. And I think with that that's what I say that to say that the Gentiles in this new area that he goes over, that's the way that they respond, right? There's some agency in going to seek out Jesus with those that are, with the mats, we assume that they're bringing people who are crippled in some way. That's why you bring someone on a mat. The rest of their sick that can probably move around a little better. I think we're supposed to think of those, the ones that they bring to the marketplaces. They can get up and go to Jesus when he passes by to touch the fringes of his garment and find some healing. There's something to be said about our agency in seeking out Jesus for wholeness. And this is what I want to say about that. He's one of my professors now. He wasn't at the time. I've talked about this book before. I was lucky enough to get an advanced copy of a new book by Scott McKnight called Invisible Jesus. It's been out for, I don't know, I want to say we're getting up close to a year when I got my copy. So maybe it's been out 6-8 months, something like that. I don't remember how early I got it before it actually released. But he was writing about this phenomenon in churches of deconstruction, of a lot of younger Christians leaving the church. They grew up in the church, they're leaving the church. And the argument that he made in his book, and I think he's right, this is based on his experience with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of college students. I will say this is my experience for people that I've known personally as well, that most of the young people who leave church, they're not leaving the faith, but they felt like, at least in the churches that they've been in, that they haven't experienced Jesus, that the church became more focused on building themselves up or gaining money or gaining power or trying to do things through human means and powers and politics and all of that. And Jesus kind of gets lost when that's your focus, right? So the reason he called his book Invisible Jesus is he was in essence arguing a lot of churches, Jesus has become invisible, and you have this exodus of young people from the church trying to find Jesus. They're like, well, if I can't find Jesus here, I'm going to go out and search for him. And that's where my mind went, of this idea of agency, of I'm seeking out Jesus. In the midst of, whether it's the disciples in the storm, whether it's someone like these Gentiles that Jesus goes to, or the woman with the bleeding problem, or the friends bringing him on the mat, there's this thing, and I want to be careful not to call it a problem, because I think that's negative, but there's this thing that is preventing wholeness, right? And they take the agency to go and seek out Jesus to bring about this wholeness that only Jesus can bring, right? And there's something to say about faith that moves us to seek Jesus out, even if it's just a little bit of faith. As Jesus says, it's the size of a mustard seed, we'd be able to move mountains, even if it's just a little bit of faith, but that moves us in our agency to move towards Jesus to find wholeness. That is, I think, for Mark, kind of the core of what it means to be a disciple.
Yeah, you know, he took that one incident where the woman touched his garment. He stopped a whole crowd of people. He already knew what had happened. There was no doubt in his mind, he already knew. But he took that time to show everybody that little bit of faith. That was important to him, important for him to tell everybody there.
Yeah.
That's a very good point.
Wasn't that the same occasion, the woman, the lepers, touched his garment?
The lepers didn't touch his garment, but Jesus touches the lepers to heal them, which is another personal kind of tidbit, right? Because you don't touch a leper, that's how you get leprosy. That's what